please." The word was barely a whisper. And then it wasn't. "They're drowning my mama in the gray water." The jade orchid fell silent the way a body does, when the heart stops not gradually, but all at once. She was 7 years old, if that. A small girl in a red top and matching shorts, her deep brown skin gleaming with the effort of running, her natural hair pressed into a puff that trembled with every breath. Her hands no bigger than a grown man's palm were pressed flat against the chest of the most dangerous man in Los Angeles, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his white shirt, like she was trying to anchor herself to something that would not move, something that would not leave her. Her wide brown eyes were red-rimmed and full of a terror that had no business living in a child's face. Crystal wine glasses hovered mid-air. 7 men in tailored clothing, men who had ordered terrible things with the same calm they ordered food, sat completely still. Because the girl hadn't just walked into a room. She had broken into a fortress. She had bypassed 4 armed floors of security, an elevator with biometric access, and a door that no uninvited guest had crossed in 6 years. And she had walked straight to him. Chung Ji-yun had not moved. He sat at the head of the room, the way a fault line sits beneath a city, quiet, enormous, and capable of leveling everything at a moment's notice. His white shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the start of the dragon inked across his collarbone, its scales climbing his neck in a pattern so detailed it seemed to breathe when he did. A gold watch sat heavy on his wrist. His dark hair was swept back from a face that had forgotten what surprise felt like. He was 34 years old. He had not been caught off guard in a very long time, until now, because around the child's neck hung a thin silver chain with a jade pendant, a pendant that Ji-yun himself had chosen and sent anonymously to a woman named Susan Tyler 3 years ago. What this man does next will not simply break the rules of the Los Angeles underworld. It will rewrite them. You need to stay until the very last second of this story, because what happens when a man who has felt nothing for 5 years is suddenly holding proof of his only secret? It will reach inside your chest and rearrange something you didn't know was movable. Before we go any further, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's with me. Now, let's step into the dark. The jade orchid existed on the 42nd floor of a building that did not appear in any public directory. Its walls were paneled in dark wood, the color of deep water, the lighting low and amber, the kind that made every face look painted rather than lived in. It was not a restaurant. It was not a lounge. It was the room where the city's most consequential decisions were made quietly, over aged plum wine, while the rest of Los Angeles believed the powerful were asleep. Ji-yun had built it, and himself, on a single principle, that stillness was power, that the man who never reacted could never be read, and the man who could not be read could never be beaten. He had governed the Western Syndicate for 4 years on that principle alone. He did not raise his voice. He did not make promises. He moved through rooms and negotiations like weather present, inevitable, and gone before anyone could fully name what had passed through. His men feared him with a reverence that bordered on religious. His rivals feared him for simpler reasons. 5 years ago, he had been different. There had been warmth buried somewhere beneath the ambition, a younger man who laughed easily and loved fiercely. But that version of Ji-yun had been extinguished slowly, quietly, by the particular violence of loss. He had stopped explaining himself. He had stopped wanting to. Tonight was meant to be routine, territorial reports, a quiet disagreement smoothed over with money and the implicit weight of something worse. He had been listening without listening, his eyes tracking the room with the detached focus of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what people wanted. Then the doors had burst open, and a 7-year-old girl in a red outfit, her small hands pressing against his chest like he was the last solid thing left in her world, had said the only sentence capable of reaching him. She was wearing Susan's necklace. Ji-yun looked down at the child, at the silver chain, at the jade pendant, swaying against her collarbone as she caught her breath. And for the first time in 5 years, something behind his eyes moved. He stood up. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He simply rose from his chair, and the entire room recalibrated around him, the way a compass needle swings toward north, instinctive, immediate, without choice. "Clear the floor," he said. That was all. 2 words, spoken at the same volume as everything else he'd said that evening, which was to say quietly enough that every man in the room had to lean in slightly to be sure they'd heard correctly. They had. They always did. Within 40 seconds, the jade orchid was empty except for Ji-yun, his head of security, Ryu, and the small girl in the red outfit who was still breathing in short, desperate pulls, her hands now hanging at her sides as though she had spent everything she had just getting here. Ji-yun crouched down in front of her, It was a striking thing to witness a man of his size and reputation folding himself down to the level of a child, his forearms resting on his knees, his dark eyes level with hers. He studied her face the way he studied everything, thoroughly, without reaction. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nilsa," she whispered. "Nilsa." He said it back to her like a confirmation. "How did you find this building?" "Mama told me." Her chin was trembling. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I should find the dragon on the tall building and tell him she called in her debt." Something moved through Ji-yun's chest, not visible, not nameable, just present, the way heat is present in a room, before anyone thinks to mention it. Susan had known about him. Not just suspected. Known. She had kept it from him for 3 years, and turned it into a contingency plan for her daughter. That was so entirely, precisely her, that the recognition of it landed somewhere in him, like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. He had first encountered Susan Tyler 4 years ago, though she had never known it. He had been moving through the periphery of a federal investigation that threatened 2 of his business interests when her byline appeared on a story that quietly, surgically dismantled his primary competitor's money laundering operation without ever touching his own. She hadn't known she was protecting him. She had simply been doing her job with a precision that stopped him mid-breath. He had read every word she had ever published after that night. He told himself it was strategic. A journalist that sharp was either an asset or a threat, and it was better to understand her than to dismiss her. He told himself that for approximately 8 months before he admitted, to no one, in the privacy of the armored car he took home alone each night, that he simply could not stop thinking about her. He remembered one night with the kind of clarity that only attaches itself to moments you wish you could take back. 14 months into watching her from a distance, she had published a story that put 3 men in federal custody and painted a target on herself so visible that 2 separate factions had discussed, on channels Ji-yun monitored, what to do about her. He had been at a dinner. Someone across the table had mentioned her name in a tone that made the hair on his arms rise, and Ji-yun had looked at the man and said, very quietly, that the journalist was not to be touched. The man had asked why. Ji-yun had said it was because she was useful, because that was the only language the table understood. He had driven home alone afterward, and sat in the dark for a long time, understanding that he had just used the full weight of his authority to protect a woman he had never spoken to, and that the reason he had given was not the reason. That was the night he stopped pretending it was strategic. She wrote about the city the way he moved through it with complete clarity about how dark it was, and no apparent intention of looking away. There was a courage in her work that was almost reckless. It unsettled him. It was the first thing that had unsettled him in years. He had never approached her. He was not a man who moved without calculating the cost of a thing, and the cost of Susan Tyler was one he couldn't afford. His world was not a place a person like her survived for long. He had kept his distance, and told himself that distance was protection. He had bought the building she lived in, quietly, through 4 layers of holding companies. He had rerouted a threat against her source network 18 months ago, without her ever knowing a threat existed. He had sent her the jade pendant on the anniversary of her most dangerous story, anonymously, because it was the closest he allowed himself to get, and now her daughter was standing in front of him, wearing it. Nilsa reached into the front pocket of her red shorts and held out a small silver flash drive. Her small hand was perfectly steady in a way that made his chest tighten. "Mama said this is the heart of the monster," she said. "She said you'd know what to do with it." Ji-yun took it from her. He closed his fingers around it slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." He stood. He looked at Ryu. "Bring the car around." Pier 12 smelled like rust and rain, and the particular kind of silence that only exists where no one is meant to witness anything. The floodlights mounted along the warehouse walls threw everything in yellow and shadow industrial. Ugly. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as expose. At the far end of the space, a cement mixer the size of a small vehicle groaned in a low, continuous rotation, its drum turning with a patience that was almost mechanical in its indifference. Below its chute, sunk into the concrete floor, was a steel basin roughly the dimensions of a phone booth. The gray sludge inside it was already thick, already rising, already at the knees of the woman standing in the center of it with her wrists bound behind her back and her jaw set in a way that refused, even now, to look like surrender. Susan Tyler was 31 years old. Her dark brown skin was damp with the cold, and with something she would not call fear, because naming it would give it permission to spread. Her natural hair was pressed flat against her temples where it had gotten wet. Her eyes, deep, dark, and furious, were fixed on the 2 men standing 20 feet away, watching her the way men watch something they've already decided the outcome of. Juan stood with his hands in his pockets. He was Ji-Yun's brother-in-law by marriage, and his right hand by 5 years of earned proximity. And he wore both of those facts, the way some men wore expensive things visibly, and with the constant low anxiety of someone who knows what they have can be taken back. He was lean and sharp-featured, his hair cut close, his coat too clean for a place like this. He had the eyes of a man who had spent years being underestimated and had never quite forgiven anyone for it. Beside him stood Kaylin, who was broader, louder in every way that Juan was controlled, holding a phone horizontally with the practiced ease of someone who understood that documentation was its own form of power. He was filming. He had been filming since they brought her in. Juan turned the phone over in his hand and looked at it with the particular distaste of a man reviewing something distasteful, but necessary. "She knew," he said, almost to himself. Kaylin looked up. "What?" "She knew someone was protecting her. She's been investigating the syndicate for 8 months. She didn't know who her ghost was, but she knew the architecture of what he'd built around her. She mapped it." He exhaled. "We found her go bag this afternoon. She had a contingency. A flash drive with financial documentation on your entire network. She'd built a kill switch in case she was ever taken." Kaylin's expression shifted slightly. "Where is it?" "We don't know." Juan's jaw tightened. "She passed it to someone before we picked her up. Whatever she prepared, it's already out of our reach, which means the only leverage we have is her." He said it without visible concern, but something behind his eyes was moving. He had planned this perfectly, and a 31-year-old journalist had still found a gap in it. That was the part he had not accounted for. Her. "He'll come," Juan said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a statement. It was the thing he was turning over in his mind, examining from every angle, and still finding it contemptible each time. Kaylin smiled at his screen. "Let him. You don't understand what you're looking at when you look at him." Juan's voice was flat. "Certain, 4 years ago, I would have told you Ji-Yun was the most dangerous man in this city, and I would have meant it without reservation." He paused. Then she started existing in his peripheral vision, and something in him went soft, quiet in the wrong way. He started making decisions like a man with something to lose. He turned slightly and looked at Susan, who looked back at him without blinking. "She doesn't even know what she did to him," he said, and there was something almost disgusted in his tone, as though the worst part of all of it was how accidental it had been. No strategy, no seduction, just a woman doing her work in the world, and a man who couldn't look away from it. "When this is over," Juan continued, "he'll grieve. He'll be dangerous the way he used to be, clean, cold, without distraction. And then he'll be mine to direct again, or he'll be finished. Either outcome solves the problem." Susan spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, and it cut across the groaning of the mixer like something deliberate. "You're going to a lot of trouble," she said. "For a man who doesn't know you're afraid of him." Juan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded at the man operating the mixer. The drum tilted. The gray sludge crept higher. Kaylin kept filming, and somewhere across the city, in the back of an armored car moving at speed through the rain-slicked streets, a 7-year-old girl in a red outfit fell asleep against the shoulder of the silent dragon, who had not once looked away from the road ahead. The SUV stopped 2 blocks from the waterfront, and Ji-Yun was already opening the door before Ryu cut the engine. The rain had thickened since they left the city. It fell in curtains now, cold and indifferent, turning the shipyard's perimeter into something that looked almost beautiful. From a distance, lights smearing across wet asphalt, the skeletal shapes of cranes rising into the dark sky like unfinished sentences. Up close, it smelled like salt and iron, and the particular stillness of a place that was waiting for something to happen. Ji-Yun looked down at Nilsa, who had woken when the car slowed, and was watching him with eyes that were too old for her face. He held her gaze for a moment. "There's a room 2 streets from here," he said. "Ryu will take you. The door is heavy, and the walls are thick, and no one alive knows it exists. You will be safe there." Nilsa looked at him the way children look at adults, when they are deciding whether to believe them, not naively, but with a terrifying accuracy. Then she nodded once. He held out his hand. She took it briefly, her small fingers pressing against his scarred knuckles, and then let go. It was not a childlike gesture. It felt like permission. He watched Ryu guide her back into the car. He watched the car pull away. Then he turned toward the water. He gave his remaining 4 men their positions along the outer fence, cover the exits, hold the perimeter, let no one in or out, and he said it the way he said everything, quietly and without the expectation of being questioned. Then he shrugged off his jacket and left it on a rusted bollard at the edge of the lot like something he had no intention of retrieving. The rain hit the dragon tattoo on his neck and ran down into his collar. He didn't notice. He rolled his sleeves to the elbow with the methodical calm of a man who had done something like this before. Though never quite like this. Never with his hands shaking so slightly. He had to press them flat against his thighs for a moment to still them. Never with this particular weight sitting directly in the center of his sternum, which he identified without sentiment as fear, not of what was ahead, of what he might find when he arrived. He checked the suppressor on his handgun. Cold metal, well-maintained, the mechanism clicking into place with a precision that had always felt like a kind of language he was fluent in. Tonight, it felt different. Mechanical. Like a tool he was using rather than an extension of himself. He moved. The shipping yard was a maze of stacked containers, rusted and enormous, their edges sheened with rain. Kalen's outer guards had been positioned well, spread wide, covering the obvious entry points, armed with the confidence of men who believed the night was working in their favor. They were wrong about the night. They were wrong about the man moving through it. Ji-yeon did not move like a man in a hurry. He moved like water finding its level low, inevitable, taking the shape of whatever space was available. The first guard he reached didn't hear him until it was already over. The second turned at exactly the wrong moment and found that instinct alone, without distance, is not enough. Neither of them had time to make a sound. He didn't pause to assess. He recalibrated and moved forward, deeper into the yard, his breath controlled, his focus narrowed to a single point somewhere beyond the walls of the warehouse ahead. Every step was driven by a calculation so precise, it left no room for anything else except the image he could not stop constructing in his mind. Of gray sludge rising slowly, of a woman with dark brown skin and furious eyes, and her wrists bound behind her back, and the pendant that meant she had trusted him long before he had given her any concrete reason to. He reached the warehouse door. He pressed one hand flat against the cold steel. Then he went in. The warehouse opened up like a held breath, releasing vast, cavernous. The ceiling lost somewhere in the dark above the floodlights. The smell hit him first. Wet concrete and machine oil and the low metallic groan of the mixer, which had not stopped turning. Then he saw her. Susan was at the center of the space, inside the steel basin, the gray sludge now at her chest. Her dark brown skin was slick with it, her natural hair matted against her temples, her shoulders drawn back in a posture that was still, somehow, defiant, her chin slightly lifted, her jaw tight, her eyes open. She was breathing in shallow, careful increments, the kind of breathing a person does when they understand that the weight pressing against their ribs is not going to negotiate. She was terrified. She was not broken. There was a distinction, and Ji-yeon registered it with a precision that went straight through him. Then her eyes found his across the warehouse floor. He watched it move through her. The recognition, the confusion, the recalibration. She knew his face. Everyone in Los Angeles knew his face. But something else was happening behind her eyes. Something slower and more seismic. A realization assembling itself from pieces she had been carrying for 3 years, without knowing what they formed. The jade pendant she wore every day. The anonymous tips that arrived before her sources were compromised. The building she'd moved into on a lease that was somehow always perfectly maintained. The ghost who had never had a face until this exact moment. Her lips parted. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The first shot came from his left. Ji-yeon moved before the sound fully registered, not away from it but through it, closing the angle on the shooter with a speed that seemed to belong to a different physics than the one governing everyone else in the room. 2 of Kalen's men were positioned behind stacked equipment on the eastern wall. 2 more emerged from behind the shipping containers to his right. They had been waiting. Hwan had planned this, with the patience of a man who had studied Ji-yeon for years, and knew exactly how he moved. What Hwan had failed to account for was what Ji-yeon was moving toward. He fought without hesitation, and without theater efficient, direct, each movement an answer to a specific problem and nothing more. A bullet grazed his left shoulder, and he registered it the way you register weather, present and irrelevant. His entire nervous system had reorganized itself around a single coordinate point in the center of that steel basin, and everything else, the pain, the gunfire, the number of men still standing existed only as variables between him and it. He reached the mixer controls on the eastern wall and fired once into the panel. The drum shuddered and slowed, but the damage was already done. The basin was full. The sludge had reached Susan's collarbones and was pressing the air from her lungs in slow, merciless increments, her breathing now audible across the space, sharp, fought for, each inhale a small act of will. He dropped both guns. The platform above the basin was 6 feet off the ground and he cleared it in a single movement, landing hard. His hands already reaching for the containment lock bolted across the front of the steel frame, a heavy industrial clasp the size of his forearm, padlocked and rusted and designed to hold under pressure. He gripped the iron pry bar that hung from a hook on the platform railing. His shoulder screamed. He didn't listen to it. Susan looked up at him from inside the gray water. This close, he could see the exact color of her eyes, dark and deep and furious, and underneath all of that, something that cracked him open more thoroughly than any bullet had ever managed. She trusted him. Even now, even here, he had not earned it. He intended to. He raised the bar and brought it down. The lock gave on the third strike. Not gracefully it tore, the metal shrieking against itself as the clasp bent and the frame buckled outward, gray sludge pushing through the gap with a pressure that had been building for the better part of an hour. Ji-Yun dropped the bar and drove his hands into the breach, fingers finding the edge of the steel panel, and pulled. The wound on his shoulder separated further. He felt it distantly. The way you feel something happening in another room. The front of the basin collapsed. The sludge poured across the platform in a thick, slow wave, and Ji-Yun was already moving into it, dropping off the edge into the basin itself, the gray water rising to his waist as he closed the remaining distance and got his arms around her. Susan made a sound when he reached her, not a cry, something smaller and more devastating than that. The sound a person makes when they have been holding themselves together by will alone and suddenly don't have to anymore. Her wrists were still bound. He snapped the zip tie with a tension cutter from his belt and felt her arms come forward, her hands gripping the front of his shirt with a strength that surprised him. He wrapped one arm around her waist and hauled her upward, his boots finding no purchase on the slicked floor of the basin, both of them staggering as he lifted her over the broken edge of the frame and onto the platform. They went down together. There was no elegant version of it his legs gave on the rain-slicked platform, and they landed on the concrete floor in a collapse of gray-soaked clothing and labored breathing, Susan across his chest, his arms still around her. Neither of them immediately able to determine which parts of themselves were still functional. She was coughing. Deep, chest-rattling pulls of air that told him exactly how close it had been. He pressed one hand flat against her back and felt her ribcage expand and contract with the effort of it. And he held her through every cough the way you hold something you have come very close to losing and have not yet processed the full weight of that proximity. When the coughing subsided, she went still against him. Her dark brown skin was streaked with gray and her hair was heavy with it, pressed flat against her neck and jaw, and he reached up without thinking and pushed it back from her face with fingers that were not entirely steady. She turned her head at the touch. Her eyes found his from a distance of inches. Up close, she was the same woman he had studied from across 3 years of careful, deliberate distance, dark eyes, strong jaw, a mouth that looked like it was built for saying things that mattered. She was also, right now, looking at him with an expression he had not been prepared for. Not gratitude, not relief, something that required more courage than either of those things. Recognition, the final piece of it landing behind her eyes in real time. "It was you," she said. Not a question. He didn't deny it. He had run out of reasons to. Yes. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved across her face, complex and unresolvable, and entirely human, and then her hand came up and pressed flat against his chest, directly over his heart, and he felt his own breath stall. He cupped her face in both hands. His thumbs moved across her cheekbones, clearing the gray from her skin in slow, deliberate strokes, and he felt her lean into the touch with the small, involuntary weight of someone who has been strong for too long. He leaned his forehead against hers. "I will always come for you," he said. It came out low and worn and completely without armor. She closed the remaining distance. The kiss was not gentle. It wasn't designed to be. It was 5 years of silence finally spoken aloud, desperate and claiming and breathless, his hands holding her face like she was something irreplaceable, because she was, because she had always been, and he was done pretending otherwise. For a moment, just one, the warehouse ceased to exist. There was no gray water, no blood, no burning city waiting outside the doors. There was only her breath against his mouth and his hands in her hair and the particular stillness of two people who have finally stopped running from the same thing at the same time. The world gave them exactly that much. Then the slow clap began. Juan stepped out from the far end of the warehouse with the unhurried confidence of a man who had arranged everything in the room, including the exits. Kaylin followed 2 steps behind, phone still in hand, still filming, wearing the expression of someone watching an investment mature. 4 armed men fanned out around them in a loose arc, weapons raised, the floodlights catching the angles of their faces. Ji-Yun rose slowly. He put himself between Susan and the guns the way you move furniture, deliberate, without drama, as if it were simply the correct configuration of the room. "There it is," Juan said. He sounded almost satisfied. "That right there, that's the thing I've been watching rot you from the inside for 3 years. He tilted his head towards Susan, who was on her feet now, one hand pressed to the wall for balance, her eyes tracking the room with a focus that had nothing defeated in it. A journalist. All of this, every decision you've softened, every advantage you've left on the table for a journalist. Ji-yun said nothing. I'm not angry, Hwan continued, and his tone confirmed that he was not. He was something colder than angry. I'm correcting a problem. You'll grieve her. You'll be terrible again. And everything goes back to what it should be. He raised the gun and pointed it at Ji-yun's chest. What happened next did not come from Ji-yun. Susan moved along the wall with a steadiness that should not have been possible for someone who had just been extracted from a concrete basin. She had seen it when they landed a flare gun in a neon orange casing, dropped by one of Kaylin's guards during the earlier chaos, lying against the baseboard 8 feet to her left. She reached it, picked it up, checked the chamber in one practiced motion. She had covered conflict zones for 6 years. She knew what a loaded flare gun looked and felt like, and fired it in a low, flat arc, directly into the pool of machinery fuel that had been leaking from the damaged equipment across the warehouse floor. The ignition was instantaneous. A wall of fire erupted between them and Hwan's men, not explosive, but total. A sheet of orange and gold that swallowed the space between in a single breath and filled the warehouse with heat and roaring light. Kaylin stumbled backward. 2 of the armed men broke their positions instinctively, retreating from the flames. Hwan did not retreat. He held his ground and raised his gun, and Ji-yun was already through the fire. He came through the gap at the edge of the wall where the fuel hadn't reached, low and fast, and hit Hwan before the man could recalibrate his aim. The gun discharged wide. Ji-yun caught the wrist that held it and bent it backward with a precision that was not cruel but was entirely without mercy. And Hwan went down to one knee with a sound that ended the conversation about who had always been stronger. What followed was not elegant. It was 5 years of proximity weaponized. Hwan knew how Ji-yun moved, and Ji-yun knew that Hwan knew, and they fought like 2 people dismantling something that had once been built with trust. Hwan was not unskilled. That was the thing people who had only ever seen Ji-yun's finished work failed to understand. The men closest to him had not survived by being weak. Hwan was fast and precise and genuinely dangerous, and for 40 seconds he was competitive, driving Ji-yun back against a support column with a combination that landed twice before Ji-yun absorbed it and reset. But Hwan was fighting to win a point. Ji-yun was fighting to get back to Susan. The difference in motivation was the difference in outcome. Ji-yun caught Hwan's third strike, redirected it, and took him down to the concrete floor in a hold that ended the fight completely. Hwan lay on his back, breathing hard, staring up at the burning ceiling. You could have just asked me to stay, Ji-yun said quietly. Hwan looked at him with something that, underneath all the anger and the calculation, was the oldest wound in the room. You were already gone, he said. The moment you saw her. Ji-yun held his gaze for one moment. Then he stood. Kaylin had not run. That was the thing that surprised Susan, who had expected him to the moment the firewall went up. Instead, he had moved to the terminal on the eastern wall, his own terminal, the one he used to manage his syndicate's financial architecture remotely, and was working at it with a speed that told her exactly what he was trying to do. He was attempting to move the assets before whatever Susan had built could reach them. He had done it before. He had burned accounts in under 3 minutes when a federal investigation got too close 2 years ago. He believed he could do it again. He was still typing when Ji-yun inserted the flash drive. Kaylin turned. His hands were still on the keyboard. He looked at the drive, then at Ji-yun, then at the screen, which had already begun its cascade. Not a deletion, something more thorough than that. A systematic unraveling of every encrypted layer Susan had spent 8 months mapping. Kaylin was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated. And what his face showed in that moment was the specific expression of a calculation arriving at an answer he had not prepared for. She built this before she was taken, Ji-yun said. She anticipated you. She anticipated Hwan. She anticipated everything except the one variable you both forgot to account for. Kaylin said nothing. Nilsa, Ji-yun said. The screen went dark. Every account, every holding, every leveraged asset, and buried reserve and encrypted partition dissolved into zeros in under 90 seconds. Kaylin's phone confirmed it. His network confirmed it. The silence of every channel that should have been active confirmed it. He set the phone down on the terminal with a steadiness that cost him something, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. A man without resources in this city was not a rival. He was simply a man. They walked out of the burning warehouse and into the rain, and neither of them looked back. Ji-yun's 4 remaining men were waiting at the perimeter, positioned exactly where he had left them, and he stopped in front of them with the warehouse light still flickering orange at his back. He looked at each of them in turn. They had served him well, and he intended to say so. "It's done," he said. "The syndicate, the territories, the infrastructure, all of it. I'm not transferring it. I'm dissolving it. Whatever you built here was yours. Take it, and do something worth doing." He paused. "Don't look for me." None of them spoke. One of them nodded. It was enough. Ryu brought the second car around with Nilsa in the back seat. Awake now, her red outfit creased from sleep, her eyes moving immediately to Susan with an intensity that belonged to someone who had spent the last several hours holding the possibility of catastrophe at a careful distance. Susan crossed to her without hesitation, opened the door, and folded herself into the seat beside her. Nilsa pressed into her side and closed her eyes. Susan's arm went around her and stayed there. Ji-yun drove. The mountain safe house was 3 hours north, a property he had purchased 7 years ago, and never told anyone about. Not Juan, not Ryu, not anyone. It sat on the edge of a ridge above the tree line, surrounded by nothing but pine and dark sky, and the particular silence of a place that has never witnessed anything it needed to forget. When they arrived, Nilsa was asleep again. Ji-yun carried her inside without being asked, and placed her on the bed in the first room off the hallway with the same careful precision he applied to everything, and stood in the doorway for a moment watching her breathe before pulling the door closed. He found Susan in the bathroom at the end of the hall, standing at the basin with both hands on the edge of it, looking at her own reflection with an expression. He understood immediately the particular exhaustion of a person cataloging what the night had cost them. He didn't speak. He filled the basin with warm water and found a cloth on the shelf above it and turned to her. She watched him cross the room. She didn't move away. He started at her hands. The gray had dried in the creases of her knuckles and along the lines of her palms, and he worked it loose slowly, his thumbs moving in careful circles against her skin, and she let him. That was the thing that undid him more than anything else the night had produced, the simple, unconditional way she let him. No calculation, no guardedness, just her hands resting in his, still and open. He moved to her face. The cloth was warm, and he drew it along her cheekbones and her jaw and the curve of her neck, and she closed her eyes and tipped her head back slightly, and he had to remind himself to keep breathing. "You bought my building," she said quietly. "Not an accusation, a door opening. Yes. You killed the story that would have exposed my source. Yes." She opened her eyes. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" He looked at her for a long moment. The honest answer was also the most vulnerable one he had ever spoken aloud. "Because I didn't think I was something you should want near you." She reached up and pressed her fingers against the dragon tattoo at the side of his neck, not tracing it, just resting there, her warm hand against his skin, and he went completely still. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said. He set the cloth down. The distance between them closed the way the night had begun, not gradually, but all at once. Her hands found his face, and his arms came around her, and everything that had been held at careful, deliberate distance for 5 years came forward at the same time, which was the only way it could have ever arrived. The lamp on the basin cast them both in gold. Then the room was dark. 6 months later, nobody could find Chang Ji-yun. This was not unusual. He had always been difficult to locate. What was unusual was that the Los Angeles underworld, the networks, the hierarchies, the carefully maintained balances of power that had governed the city's shadow economy for 2 decades, was quietly, methodically, coming apart at the seams, not through violence, through exposure. Someone was feeding information to federal investigators with a precision that suggested intimate, first-hand knowledge of every operation, every alliance, every buried account. Arrests were happening. Structures were collapsing. Men who had believed themselves untouchable were discovering the specific texture of consequences. The city didn't know what to call it. They called it a ghost. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Susan Tyler sat at the kitchen table of a house that had no address in any system she had ever used professionally, her laptop open, her third cup of coffee cooling beside it, working on a story that her editor had already called the most important piece of investigative journalism the publication had run in a decade. She was not supposed to have the documents she was working from. She was not going to explain where she had gotten them. Nilsa was at the table beside her, 7 years old and fully recovered, and currently engaged in a fierce argument with a long division problem that she was losing but refusing to concede. Her deep brown face was set in the particular expression of a child who has decided that mathematics is a personal enemy. She had Susan's stubbornness and her own very specific brand of determination, and she had been sleeping through the night for 4 months without once waking up afraid. Ji-yun came in from the back of the house with 2 plates of food he had made himself, which he did every morning now without commentary, as though it were simply a thing he had always done. He was wearing a linen shirt with the sleeves pushed up, his scars visible along his forearms, the dragon tattoo climbing his neck above the open collar. He set a plate in front of Nilsa, who said thank you without looking up from her worksheet, and placed the second beside Susan's laptop, and pressed one brief kiss to the top of her head as he straightened. She caught his wrist before he could move away. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "The Kalen files," she said quietly. "The ones that arrived this morning. Those came from inside his own archive. The only people who had access to that archive were his 3 most senior lieutenants and whoever dismantled his network in November." Ji-Yun said nothing. His expression gave her nothing. It never did, and she had stopped expecting it to. "You're still in there," she said. "Not an accusation, an understanding." "I left the syndicate," he said. "I didn't leave the city." She held his gaze for a long moment. This was the thing she was still learning about him, that he was not a man who had chosen between his darkness and his love for her. He was a man who had found a way to put one in service of the other. He had not dismantled himself. He had redirected. And the instrument he was using to clean 6 years of damage from the city's underbelly was the same one she used everyday information, precisely placed, at exactly the right moment. She released his wrist. He pulled a chair beside her, sat down, and reached across the table to correct something on Nilsa's worksheet without a word. Nilsa looked at the correction, looked at him, and went back to work. Susan turned back to her screen. Outside, the morning light came through the kitchen window in long, unhurried lines, and the tree line beyond the yard was green and still and completely without threat. For now, and if that ever changed, the 3 of them already knew exactly what they were capable of. The dragon had not gone to sleep. He had simply learned what was worth protecting, and that made him more dangerous than he had ever been. The most powerful thing a person can do is decide what they will use their strength for. Destruction is easy. Protection requires everything. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, smash that like button, subscribe so you never miss another story like this one, and drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. Until next time, take care of yourselves. You deserve a love that would burn a city down to find you.